Here's a question. What if I told you there's a place in Florida, a place you've almost certainly driven past without stopping, where Spanish pirates torched a fort? An American general committed what most lawyers today would call a war crime. A 15-year-old girl performed an act of mercy, so stunning that Congress eventually gave her a medal for it, and then forgot to deliver the medal before she died. A place where the railroad that built a town also chose which neighboring town would simply cease to exist. Where the lighthouse was blown up not once, not twice, but in three separate centuries of very motivated human beings trying very hard to break an 80-foot tower made of recycled empire. A place where the same mosquito-choked marsh that once spread yellow fever now gets written up in birding magazines as a healing landscape. Florida has a gift for irony, but this particular stretch of North Florida coast, this is not irony. This is a whole curriculum. The place is called St. Mark's. Population, roughly 300 souls. History, considerably more than it has any right to. Pull over. You're going to want to hear this. To understand St. Mark's, you have to stand at a very specific piece of ground. Drive 20 miles south of Tallahassee. Watch the suburbs dissolve. Watch the oaks close in. Watch the road narrow down to 2 lanes. And then suddenly, open up to flat marsh on both sides. Stop at the point where the St. Mark's River and the Wakulla River run together before pouring into Appalachia Bay in the Gulf of Mexico. This confluence, this exact spot, it has been, at various points in recorded and unrecorded history, a food source, a trading post, a fortress, a barracks, a hospital, a battlefield, a prison, and a state park with a very informative 18-minute video. But long before any European decided this piece of ground was worth fighting for, the Appalachian people were here. The Appalachian were not a small tribe of wandering hunters. They were a sophisticated, settled agricultural society. They farmed corn, beans, and squash in the fertile fields of what the Spanish would later call the province of Appalachia. They built towns. They maintained trade networks stretching hundreds of miles. Their fields were so productive that Spanish colonizers in the Caribbean actually relied on Appalachian wheat exports to keep their settlements fed. Think about that. The people who would eventually be dispossessed, enslaved, and nearly wiped out were, at this moment in history, feeding the very empire that would come to destroy them. There's a lesson in there somewhere, and it's not a comfortable one. History, in places like this, has layers. And the top layer, the one with the fort, the railroad, and the lighthouse, is not the oldest one. Not even close. In 1679, the Spanish governor of Florida, a man named Pablo de Hita y Salazar, which is a name that would require 3 business cards, looked at this confluence of rivers and said, essentially, we should put a fort there. He was right. He was also, in a way he could not possibly have anticipated, setting in motion one of the longest-running real estate disputes in North American history. The first fort was a wooden stockade. Its walls were plastered with lime to give them the appearance of stone, a decorative bluff intended to discourage attack. It discouraged attack for exactly 3 years. In 1682, French pirates sailed in, looked at the fort, possibly admired the paintwork, and then looted and burned it anyway. The Spanish rebuilt. Then a hurricane drowned the garrison and destroyed it again. They rebuilt. Then the British, fighting with the Creek allies, destroyed the Spanish missions across the region in 1704, and the fort was abandoned again. Are you sensing a theme? The Spanish kept coming back. 1718, they sent a captain named Jose Primo de Rivera to build something more serious, something in stone, a triangular fort with bastions at each corner and walls thick enough to absorb artillery fire. They started the stone fort in 1739. They were still building it in 1763 when Spain lost Florida to Britain at the end of the French and Indian War and had to hand over the keys, such as they were, to the British, who called it Fort St. Mark's and promptly found it isolated, difficult to supply, and essentially useless. The British eventually left it in the care of a single trader who used it as a commercial outpost, which is a magnificent demotion from imperial stronghold to convenience store. Spain got Florida back in 1783, a thank you from the newly independent United States, who appreciated Spanish support during the Revolution. Now, at this point, you may be thinking, surely the trouble is over. And don't call me Shirley. You would be thinking wrong. In 1800, a man named William Augustus Bowles arrived. Bowles was a former British Army officer who had gone rogue in the most spectacular fashion possible. He declared himself the Director General of an entity he called the State of Muskogee, a would-be sovereign nation in Florida. Commissioned himself a fleet of pirate ships, recruited an army of white settlers, black soldiers, and Creek and Seminole warriors, and laid siege to Fort San Marcos de Apalache. For a brief, genuinely bizarre moment in 1800, there was a third nation in Florida that belonged to neither Spain, nor Britain, nor the United States. It was called Muskogee. It had a pirate army, and its capital was essentially a half-finished fort in a Florida swamp. A Spanish flotilla eventually arrived, and Bowles melted back into the wilderness. The state of Muskogee lasted a few weeks. Then Florida. By 1818, the fort was still technically Spanish. Florida was still technically a Spanish colony, and Andrew Jackson was technically under orders from Washington not to start an international incident. He started an international incident. Jackson was commanding U.S. forces during the First Seminole War. A conflict sparked when U.S. troops attacked a Creek village in Georgia, and Creek and Seminole warriors retaliated. Jackson was given authority to pursue hostile forces into Florida, with the understanding that he would not officially seize Spanish territory or provoke a war with Spain. He seized the fort. He hanged Alexander Arbuthnot, a Scottish trader accused of aiding the Creek resistance. He executed Robert Armbruster, a British subject who had been training Seminole warriors. And he had Josiah Francis, the Creek prophet, the leader of the Red Stick religious movement, hanged near the fort without trial. Washington was horrified, then furious, then argued about it for months. But here's the thing about Andrew Jackson in Florida. His action, however legally questionable, worked. Spain could see that it could no longer hold Florida against American pressure. Within a year, the Adams-Onis Treaty was signed. Florida was sold to the United States for $5 million. The fort that 7 different flags had flown over now belonged to the United States permanently, except for the Confederacy, but we'll get to that. Now, woven through all of this history, running right underneath the marching feet and the diplomatic fury and the executions, is a story that almost nobody knows, and that deserves far better than the small plaque it gets in the state park. Her name was Millie Francis. She was 15 years old. Millie was the daughter of Josiah Francis, the same prophet Jackson would later hang. She had already survived 3 wars by the time she was a teenager. She had fled her home in Alabama with her family, living in refugee camps in Spanish Florida. In March of 1818, A Georgia militiaman named Duncan McCrimmon decided to go fishing beyond the guard posts. He got lost. He wandered for days. Creek warriors found him, captured him, tied him to a tree, and prepared to execute him. Millie Francis intervened. She pleaded for the soldier's life. She argued until the warriors agreed to spare him. The man who had come to Florida as part of the army making war on her people, she saved his life. Because, as she would later say, she would have done the same for anyone. The story spread through the newspapers across the United States. People called her the new Pocahontas. Money poured in from the public. McCrimmon himself traveled back to propose marriage. She declined. She explained that she had acted for humanity alone, not for reward, not for gratitude, not for marriage, just because it was right. While that story was circulating, her father was captured and hanged by Jackson's order at the fort where she had lived. Think about that for a moment. Her act of mercy toward one soldier became a national sensation. The army she showed mercy toward hanged her father without trial. The Congress eventually passed a bill in 1844 awarding Millie a pension of $96 a year and a specially struck Medal of Honor, one of the first ever awarded to a woman by the U.S. government. The medal arrived in the spring of 1848. So did tuberculosis. Millie Francis died on May 19th, 1848. The medal had arrived days before. She was living in a dirt floor log cabin in what is now Oklahoma, having survived the Creek Trail of Tears. There is no record of what happened in the medal. The location of her grave is unknown. There's a small plaque for her at the state park, which is not nothing, but it's also not enough. Let's come forward in time. By the 1820s, Florida belongs to the United States. Tallahassee has been selected as the territorial capital. Chosen, legend has it, because it was roughly halfway between the rival cities of Pensacola and St. Augustine, which is kind of a geographic compromise that satisfies nobody completely. Tallahassee has a problem. It is inland. It is surrounded by fertile land being rapidly converted to cotton plantations. And cotton in 1825 has only one destination that matters: a ship. Enter St. Mark's. The old fort, the pirate town, the empire and embarrassment towns suddenly finds a new identity: cotton port. Wagons began rolling down loaded with cotton bales. Ships were waiting in the deep channel the Spanish had called the Spanish Hole, a deep, natural water pocket where vessels could moor even at low tide. So they built a railroad. In 1837, the Tallahassee-St. Mark's Railroad opened, one of the first railroads in Florida and one of the first in the entire South. It was 20 miles long. The first cars were pulled by mules, actual mules, walking next to the actual wooden trails, dragging wagons adapted for the purpose. Within a few years, they had real locomotives, and those locomotives made the cotton economy hum. Now, here's where it gets interesting from a purely human standpoint. There was another town along these rivers, a town called Magnolia. Magnolia had a post office. Magnolia had banks. Magnolia had the kind of civic ambition that builds monuments and names streets. Magnolia had big dreams and decent bones. Magnolia did not have the railroad. The railroad alignment, the investment, the terminals, they landed just a bit downriver at St. Mark's. And Magnolia vanished. Not in a disaster, not in a war, not in a fire or a flood. People simply moved. Buildings were dismantled. Some of them floated away on barges to places with better prospects. The town ghosted itself, quietly and completely, leaving behind nothing but a name on old maps and a lesson in how geography becomes destiny when the railroad decides where to stop. We talk about disruption today as though it's a new phenomenon. But in 1837, on the Wakulla River in North Florida, a railroad alignment decision caused an entire town to simply cease to exist. Magnolia never made it into the history books. St. Mark's made it to a state trail. During the Civil War, the railroad became a Confederate lifeline. The old Spanish fort was renamed Fort Ward, reinforced with earthworks, and held for the duration. In March of 1865, Union forces, including men from the 2nd and 99th U.S. Colored Infantry, came ashore near the lighthouse and tried to take the fort and march on Tallahassee. They were stopped at the Battle of Natural Bridge. Tallahassee was never captured. It remains, to this day, the only Confederate state capital east of the Mississippi that Union forces never took. Fort Ward, formerly Fort St. Mark's, formerly San Marcos de Apalache, was the last coastal Confederate fort to lower its flag. On May 10, 1865, 1 month after Appomattox, the fort that had been taken by pirates, hurricanes, the British, the Americans, an adventurer with a pirate navy, and Andrew Jackson was never, in the end, taken by the Union Army. The most successfully defended structure in the history of the American Civil War is a half-finished Spanish fort in a Florida swamp. Drive past the fort. Follow the refuge road south through a tunnel of live oaks, dripping Spanish moss, and eventually the forest opens onto something that deserves every postcard it's ever been put on: a white lighthouse, 82 feet tall, standing at the edge of Appalachie Bay, looking out across a flat stretch of water that seems to go all the way to Mexico. The first lighthouse here was commissioned in 1828. Congress appropriated $6,000. The contractor built it with hollow walls. The customs collector refused to accept it. The contractor was accused of fraud against the United States government. A second contractor was brought in. The lighthouse was finally lit in 1831 by its first keeper, Samuel Crosby, using whale oil. 11 years later, erosion was eating the shoreline beneath it. The tower was dismantled and a new one built farther inland, this time on a foundation of stone taken from the old Spanish fort. Recycled empire, repurposed as navigational aid. The new tower's walls are 4 feet thick at the base. They needed to be. In September of 1843, a hurricane made direct landfall. The keeper, John Hungerford, sheltered his family inside the tower as the storm destroyed most of the nearby town of Port Leon, killing multiple residents and wiping it entirely off the map. But the tower held. During the Civil War, Confederate forces used the keeper's dwelling as a barracks. When Union ships appeared offshore in 1862, they shelled the lighthouse. Union sailors returned in 1863 and burned the wooden steps inside the tower to prevent Confederates from climbing it. In 1865, the retreating Confederates drilled holes in that tower and packed them with explosive charges. They set off the charges. They blew an 8-foot hole in the wall. The lighthouse stood. They tried again. The lighthouse stood. After the war, the tower was repaired and extended an additional 10 feet, relit on January 8, 1867. It has been through more than 100 hurricanes since. It was automated in 1960. In October, tens of thousands of monarch butterflies gather at the lighthouse grounds before crossing the Gulf of Mexico on their migration south. They cover the trees. They drift through the air. They rest on the lighthouse walls, the same walls that survived pirates, hurricanes, cannon fire, and a determined attempt at demolition, covered in butterflies. If that isn't a metaphor, I don't know what is. In 1931, the federal government established the St. Mark's Migratory Bird Refuge, one of the earliest wildlife refuges in the United States. The same marshes that had killed Spanish soldiers with yellow fever, the same swamps that had swallowed armies and buried forts were now officially designated as protected habitat for migratory birds. The land that once made people sick was now sold in birding magazines and ecotourism brochures as a restorative natural landscape. Healing, they call it now, therapeutic. The healing landscape that used to kill you with mosquitoes. Florida's relationship with its own geography has always involved a certain creative reframing. Today, the refuge covers about 68,000 acres of pine forest, freshwater marsh, tidal wetlands, and coastal habitat. It's on the central flyway for migratory birds, meaning that twice a year, species ranging from warblers to painted buntings to bald eagles pass through in numbers that make serious birders drive from 3 states away. The river that once carried cotton and cannon now carries kayaks. The railroad that decided the fate of 2 towns is now a paved trail 21 miles long. People bike it from Tallahassee, arriving in St. Mark's sweaty and triumphant, looking for cold drinks and fried food. The cotton that moved on that railroad is gone. The plantations it came from are gone, but the trail remains, just slower and with better snacks. Back downtown, and we're going to use that word generously, with affection and no condescension, St. Mark's today is a place that runs on water, time, and seafood. There are waterfront places with screen doors and ceiling fans where the specials boards changes with the catch and the conversation never really stops. Stone crab in October, grouper through the season, shrimp so fresh it seems like an argument for living closer to the Gulf. Ask the right person and they'll point out the mound that predates the fort. They'll tell you which foundation stone came from the Spanish fort and ended up in the Lighthouse base. They'll tell you about the storm of 1843 that wiped Port Leon off the map. They'll point toward the trees and tell you that somewhere under the roots of a park picnic area, a Creek prophet is probably buried, hanged on Jackson's orders, location unrecorded. History in St. Mark's is not in a museum behind glass. It's under your feet. The festivals are small and genuine. The Stone Crab Festival in October draws enough people to constitute a legitimate crowd by St. Mark's standards, which means you can't find a parking spot, and someone has already eaten the best crab before you get there. The debates at the marina are about the boat ramps and water depths and whose cousin blocked whose fishing spot. It's the kind of place where the big controversies involve stop signs, speed limits, and the philosophical question of whether the new thing will ruin the character of the old thing, which, if you paid attention today, is a question St. Mark's has been answering for about 350 years. The answer, so far, is probably not. Character here is load-bearing. So, why does any of this matter to you in your car with your lane assisting and your podcast cue and your GPS telling you that in zero point 0.4 miles you should turn right towards something that sounds more important? Well, here's why. St. Mark's looks at 45 miles an hour like the end of the road, which it is. Literally, the highway dead ends here, but the end of the road is not the end of the story. It never is. This is a place where 3 empires came to embarrass themselves, and a fourth built a country out of the wreckage, where a railroad decided, with the casual indifference of economics, that one town would live and one would die, where a 15-year-old girl performed an act of grace that the nation celebrated and then systematically ignored when it became inconvenient, where a lighthouse that was built wrong, moved, rebuilt, shelled, blown up, and repaired is still casting a light across Appalachia Bay. Where in October, the monarch butterflies rest on limestone walls before crossing the Gulf of Mexico. And they don't know or care that those walls once held a Spanish garrison, a Confederate battery, and an explosive charge that failed to bring them down. The butterflies just need a place to rest. Don't we all? St. Marks, Florida. Population roughly 300. History considerably larger than its footprint. Sitting right there at the end of the road, patient as a lighthouse, waiting to see if you'll stop. There are places in this country that contain everything, that hold centuries of hope and failure and grace and stubbornness. In a few acres of ground by a river, you could drive right past them, or you can pull over and let the place tell you what it knows. That's the end of the road for today. Go somewhere that earns a second look. This has been Drive Thru Towns. I'm your host, Andrew Wilcox. A special thanks to Chloe Jones for providing our music. If you enjoyed this journey, please follow the podcast to stay updated on all our upcoming episodes. To keep the conversation going, you can connect with me on Instagram at 50 State Family. Find me on LinkedIn under Wilcox Legal, or reach out directly via email at wilcoxlegal@gmail.com. Thanks for tuning in, and I'll see you on the next road.
'Cause I was wandering free on an American dream with a million things to see and do. But it's all good, I'm fine. Had the time of my life, 'cause I did it all. We